Hello and welcome to Written Words, and this video is our last in our GCSE texts series. We've taken a look at A Christmas Carol, Macbeth and Inspector Calls, and so now we're going to finish off with the poetry paper. The poetry paper consists of two sections. The first section is based on a selection of poems from the poetry anthology, and the second section is based on two unseen poems that the candidates haven't been able to prepare for because they haven't seen the poems before. So looking first of all at the poetry anthology, it comes in two halves and each half contains 15 poems. The first half is poems on the subject of love and relationships, and the second half is poems on the subject of power and conflict. So you have to choose one of those two themes and study the poems in detail before the exam. And in our house we are reading the power and conflict selection, 15 poems on the subject of power and conflict. And the poems in that section are Ozymandias by Shelley, London by William Blake, an extract from The Prelude by William Wordsworth, My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Exposure by Wilfred Owen, Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney, Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, Remains by Simon Armitage, Poppies by Jane Weir, War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, Tissue by Imtiaz Darker, The Emigre by Carol Rumans, Checking Out Me History by John Agard, and Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. So there are some very nice poems in that selection. So then I had a look on the AQA website to see what kind of questions the candidates are given in the exam. And for the poetry anthology question, you are given the text, the full text of one of the poems, and asked to analyse a particular theme in that poem. And then you are asked to analyse that same theme in another of the poems, but you're not given the text for that one, so you have to rely on your memory for that part of the question. Then for the section on unseen poetry, you are given the texts of two poems that are not in the anthology, and candidates have to answer a question on both of those poems. Back several decades ago when I was doing my GCSE, I studied the poems of Wilfred Owen, and I was quite excited to find that one of Wilfred Owen's poems is included in this anthology. It's Exposure. So for the purposes of this video, I thought I would have a look in more detail at Exposure and then compare it with another one of the poems in the collection, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Both of these poems are on the subject of war and fighting and the experience of being involved in the fighting. And there are some similarities, but there are some differences in the moods of the poems and the outlook of the poet. So let's begin by taking a look at Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army, a attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is that why we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed, on us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So it's a very sad poem. It's about the futility of war and the pointlessness of it. So to start with, let's just have a look at a couple of the notes that are in my version of the Wilfred Owen poems. The first note says it's an ironic echo of Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. Ode to a Nightingale we looked at a little while ago in my earlier video on birds in literature. And there is a line in that poem, "My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense." And we get echoes of that in Wilfred Owen's poem here. And then there is a reference to the salient, and in here it says, "The front line in places jutted into enemy territory, and at such salients the fighting tended to be fiercest." Then on the line, "Like a dull rumour of some other war," there is a note that tells us this is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, which speaks of wars and rumours of wars. The ranks of grey that are mentioned in the third stanza are referring to the German troops because they wore grey uniforms. The stanza that talks about home, about glimpsing the sun fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels, is a reference to the song "Keep the home fires burning, though your lads are far away they dream of home." So let's take a closer look at the poem then. The structure of the poem is very interesting. There are 8 stanzas and each one follows the same pattern. There are 5 lines. The first 4 of those lines follow a rhyming scheme, with the first and the last line rhyming with each other, and the second and third line rhyming with each other. Rhyming in a loose sense. Some of them are exact rhymes, but some of them are more half rhymes. But it still gives the poem some shape. And then finally the 5th line is different altogether. It doesn't rhyme with any of the lines and it's shorter and it often repeats itself. We have, "But nothing happens. What are we doing here? But nothing happens. But nothing happens. Is that why we are dying? We turn back to our dying. For love of God seems dying. But nothing happens." So, "but nothing happens" is repeated several times, as is the word dying. So with that short line at the end of each stanza, there is some impact. It is Wilfred Owen asking us to think about the point of what is going on, and whether indeed there even is a point to it. There is quite a lot of alliteration and assonance in this poem too. We have flowing flakes that flock. And we have the sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. The s sound almost sounds like the whizzing sound of the bullets flying through the air. The pronouns that are used in the poem are we and us and our. It's the first person plural. So that's very direct. It's telling us, the poet is telling us here that he is there. He is part of what is going on. He has experienced this with other people. And it's also in the present tense, which again adds to the directness. It's as if he's reporting from the scene in real time. Here we are. This is what is happening. We are doing this right now. There are a lot of metaphors in the poem too. The imagery is very vivid. For example, the barbed wire is compared to brambles. And the fires at home, we are told, are glozed with crusted dark red jewels, as if the memories of home are something very precious like jewels. There is a lot of personification too in the poem. The cold in particular is personified. For example, the merciless iced east winds that knife us. The east winds are merciless, so they're given human qualities. It's the east wind that's sticking the knives in them, not the enemy, but the wind itself and its coldness. Then the pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. So we're told the snow has fingers and it's feeling for their faces. Not the fingers of enemy soldiers, but the fingers of snow. The real enemy here is the cold. That's what they're trying to survive in spite of. Not the enemy, but the cold itself. Another example of personification is when we're told Dawn amassing in the east her melancholy army. Dawn is the commander in charge of the army. So again, it's the elements that are in charge here, the elements that they're fighting against. They're fighting against Dawn's army and against the cold. There is a lot of cold vocabulary in the poem. We have ice, snow, frost, shivering, shudders. It's a very cold poem. The cold in this poem matters. The cold itself is a character. It's a personified character in the poem. And it's not a nice character. The cold is what is to be feared. The cold is what is killing people. More than the bullets of the enemies, it's the cold. The enemy soldiers themselves are very vague in this poem. We're told about ranks on shivering ranks of grey. So it's just a vague greyness representing the German soldiers. And there are bullets which must have come from the enemy soldiers' guns, but there is no person actually in sight. He speaks of a dull rumour of some other war, which, as I've already mentioned, is a reference to Matthew's Gospel. And here he's using that as if they're not really part of the war. What they're fighting is something different. They're not fighting Germans here, they're fighting cold, they're fighting for their lives. The poem is called Exposure because they are exposed to the elements, the harsh, cruel elements that are the real killers here. And then in the last stanza, the burying party comes along in the morning to find the people who have died, to find those who've fallen victim to the cold in the night. So the real danger is not the enemy bullets, but the cold. And then we have the repetition, the constant repetition, but nothing happens. And that repetition emphasizes the futility of this war. They're dying, but what are they dying for? Nothing's happening. They're just dying. Why are they really there, freezing to death, with the enemy only a nebulous idea out of sight? So that's a very sad experience of fighting in the trenches in the First World War. Wilfred Owen himself fought during the First World War and was killed in action, dying at a very young age. So the other poem that I'm going to compare with this one is The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a very well-known poem. And this poem is also based on a true event, a real war that did happen. It's set during the Crimean War at the Battle of Balaclava, and it describes a very unfortunate event which happened when an order was misunderstood, resulting in the deaths of many British soldiers. So let's take a look at The Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian, reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So this poem is much more rhythmic in style. It's written in the form of a ballad, and to a certain extent it's more positive in tone. However, it does still have a sad note underpinning it. This poem is a hymn of praise to bravery. Its last verse uses words like glory, honour and noble, and we're also told about heroes. In this poem, the enemy is more present than in Wilfred Owen's poem. We're told outright that the enemy is Cossack and Russian, and we're told about cannon and shot and shell. Again, some alliteration, shot and shell, making the sound of the missiles flying through the air. There are actual weapons here. We're not told about any weapons in Wilfred Owen's poem, but here we're told about shooting and cannon, guns and sabres. There are two very negative words, death and hell, repeated regularly throughout the poem, but that is balanced out by some positive words like hero, glory, honour and noble. So there is a negative side to the poem, but there is also a positive side. It's about a very sad and unfortunate event. The Light Brigade believe they've been told to charge, and so they do. They don't question their orders, but it turns out it was a mistake. And many of them lose their lives as a result. But the poem tells us there is a positive outcome because the soldiers fought bravely and are remembered as heroes. So it hasn't been completely pointless, unlike in Wilfred Owen's view, where the half-known faces are forgotten and have died for nothing. The poem, as I already mentioned, is very rhythmic. It reminds me a lot of the poem From a Railway Carriage, faster than fairies, faster than witches, bridges and houses, hedges and ditches, which is written to sound like the sound of a railway carriage. And the rhythm in this poem, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600, gives the impression of horses charging. And there is much more action in this poem than in Wilfred Owen's poem. In Wilfred Owen's poem, the soldiers are very passive. They are sitting out the night, hoping that they survive. They're just waiting to find out whether they're still alive the next morning. But in Tennyson's poem, they are actively charging towards the enemy with the purpose of fighting them. So although it's a very sad story here, and the consequences are tragic, this is tempered by Tennyson by the fact that he doesn't mention how many have died. It's as if he's glossing over that part, lest it damage morale or taint the memory of the heroes. We're repeatedly told that the 600 went into battle. We're given the exact number, 600 rode into battle. But we're told that not the 600 came back. But we don't know how many. And he speaks of all that was left of them. But he doesn't say how many were left. That's left to us to guess. Again, there are some biblical references in this poem. We're told about the valley of death, which is a reference to Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." So although this poem tells us of something very sad, and Tennyson speaks of the terrible reality of war, the overall tone of the poem is praise for the heroes. It's a hymn of praise to the heroes who rode so bravely into battle. And this contrasts with exposure, where the soldiers are not described as heroes. They're described as half-known faces. And the reality of war to them is overwhelming. So which of those poems do you prefer? I've very much enjoyed reading some of the other poems in the collection as well. Some that I already knew and some that were new to me as well. So perhaps some of those may feature in future videos as well. So that's a brief look at a couple of poems in the poetry anthology for the AQA GCSE English literature paper here in the UK for 16-year-olds. That's the last in my series of videos on GCSE text. I'm going to move on now to some different subjects. In my next video, I'm going to share some of my own writing, and then after that, I'm going to go out and about a little and explore some interesting literary places. So thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.